Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Ahmed Tahsin. I'm a PhD student at Indiana University, Bloomington, and it's a pleasure to be here. So, as you can see, today I'll be talking about the film named Rohingya by Weiwei. And just to give you a little context before I move in to my paper, which is kind of created from scratch for this conference, I was thinking of an idea when I had to propose and submit here. So pardon if there are loopholes or gaps, and feel free to ask the questions that would help me framing it or enhancing the paper. So it's a work in progress. And the context, as I was saying, in 2017, the Myanmar military orchestrated, as we all might know, and if it's okay if we don't, ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya people in Myanmar. Rohingya is a Muslim minority in Myanmar, and forcing over less than 1 million refugees to flee into the overcrowded camps of Cox's Bazar that is located in Bangladesh. So they share a border. And the reason I said over less than 1 million, because the exact number is 0.8, but I always believe strongly that the quantified number is always less than the actual truth. So that's how it happens in this kind of conflicting zones. Weiwei, if I have to give a little background, a Chinese dissident artist renowned for his global activism against authoritarianism, who arrived in these camps as an outsider to the film, to make this film. And this film emerges from, we can say, a very fraught or critical ethical terrain where questions of access, authorship, and this mediation or sensory ethnography, because it's not someone else making about something else that where I don't belong and I'm accessing that. So that's the question. It's a very wonderful film, by the way. So I'll share my opinion. So it's as I was saying, access, authorship, and the kind of mediations I'll be talking about, kind of inseparable from the very act of witnessing. So today I argue that Weiwei's Rohingya film transforms the documentary screen. When I'm saying dispositive, it's not only the camera and equipment that is on set, but also the screen is part of it, giving us access and kind of dwell in that world. So the screen is part of the discussion in that case. So what I'm saying is screen, and I'm calling it anarchival dispositive, not archival, like the contrast of the traditional archiving process. And it's a method of witnessing, in this case, with the example of this case study, that refuses to offer narrative closure. And we'll see some examples how that works in the film. By narrative closure, I also mean the kind of interpretive mastery, when we, as an audience, have the tendency to find and form meaning out of it, as also you have been talking about. When something is quite alien, quote unquote, to us, how we form meaning out of it, and how do we dwell with that meaninglessness in that case. So rather than turning refugee life into a story to consume, in this film, Weiwei unsettles the viewer, immersing them in a dispossessive pedagogy, that's what I'm saying. And it's a practice of witnessing with rather than interpreting about. And I use the term dispositive pedagogy to describe a way of learning and witnessing that gives the need to fully understand something or explain something or to master what is being seen. So unlike other documentary practices or pedagogical practices, let's put it in that way, which often teaches viewers to extract meaning and seek a closure, dispositive pedagogy invites us to stay with discomfort. I'm borrowing definitely from Haraway's "Staying with Trouble" term, but that was on ecological relationship and entanglement. Here I'm using a different context. So to stay with this discomfort, to witness without turning complex lives into simplified narratives. It's not about reaching conclusions, but about enduring with the unsettled, open-ended nature of what the film shows or it refuses to show. So instead of asking in the pedagogical context, as an educator or documentary studies educator, the question is not what does this document show, but it invites us to ask how this documentary repositions us as an audience, as witness. So Rohingya film does not explain refugee life. It disorients us from the comfort of explanation. It's a film without any dialogue. There are ambient score, but I'll be speaking over it while we go through the slides so that we can get an idea of the visual. So I use the term anarchival dispositive to describe how this film, Rohingya, arranges camera, sound, and screen as well, in a way that refuses the archive's traditional role of capturing and stabilizing meaning. So drawing from Foucault's idea of the dispositive as an apparatus that organizes perception and power, Derrida's critique of archive fever, which is the compulsion to preserve and to control. This term helps describe a filmic method that loops, fragments, and unsettles rather than collects and explains. In other words, this film's dispositive is anarchival because it refuses to let images be pinned down or finalized as knowledge. Unlike documentaries that use camera to reveal, to explain, guide interpretation, this film offers no interviews, no narrative, no dramatic events, no linear arc, which is very different in Weiwei's other documentary films he made on refugee crisis, on global refugee crisis, like, for example, Human Flow, which is a studio film. This is the film which is an independent project, and coming back to what low resolution file and film is, we already had the discussion. So it's also an example of that kind of sort of an approach. And that's why possibly he experimented with the style of making. Coming back to where I was, so there's no linear arc here. Instead, it immerses us in repetitive acts like eating, sleeping, bamboo cutting, prayer, children going to school in the refugee camp, regular life, entrepreneurial activities, groceries, all sorts of ordinary rhythms of life. So, foregrounding these ordinary rhythms of life, instead of dramatizing the refugee identity or the binary or duality of who is the victim and who's not, so those kind of aspects doesn't work in this kind of setup. So, traditional documentary pedagogies, let's say, if I just briefly say, for example, Pearsonian's notion of the creative treatment of actuality, or which emphasize the filmmaker's role in shaping reality into some meaningful narratives and insights. We also have the history of observational cinema, exemplified by David McDougall's concept of unprivileged camera, where the camera doesn't know what's going to happen, not from this point of view, but it seeks knowledge through immersive witnessing. So I'm borrowing, kind of extending all those traditions, and let's see how can I extend it to something new. We also know the didactic essay film practice, which prioritizes argumentative clarity and educational closure. So across these all modes, documentary practice is often framed as a tool for interpretive mastery, a means to reveal, explain, and comprehend. And to quote from a book called Visualizing Theory by Lucian Taylor, vision is where we mistake our contact for distance. Weiwei's camera refuses that distance, implicating the viewer in a co-endurance of vulnerability. So we become a part of that unsettled identity that we see on screen, being unable to make meaning out of it. The screen itself becomes a site of dispossession. The screen is not a window to reality, dismantling the viewer's position of knowing. So we'll see sequences like, as you can see, a little bit of glimpses of it. The camera moves to street level, observing people walking in multiple directions, left to right, right to left, the way it began, without clear narrative and purpose. There are no introductions, explanations of who these people are. Sequences like that continues observing people, in motion without foregrounding any central character. Faces appear, disappear. The camera resists constructing a human interest narrative, and keeping viewers in a state of sensory immersion rather than guided storytelling. Sometimes we see, I guess we already got a glimpse of, for example, there's a kid that, I don't know, I can see it now. No, right. So at first it gives a feeling like we get inside. The door is half, almost closed. Eyes are peeping out, and barely open door. So camera lingers on this half-hidden moment throughout the film. That's kind of the stylistic aesthetics we can see, and it kind of prevents full visibility. And what does it mean then? Does it frustrate the viewer's desire to see and know? That's the question. And we get a refusal of voyeuristic access that is often complained in many practice of documentary filmmaking. Positioning the screen itself, what I'm arguing here, is as a threshold. When the screen is a threshold that we even cannot cross. As viewer, we are stuck with it. So talking about the screen as an archive, there's an article named "The Body and the Archive" by Alan Sekula, S-E-K-U-L-A, which was in a different context, but that talks about the body of labor. And I'm kind of borrowing the argument. So in the book, in the article, Alan argued that photographic archives have historically been tools of control, used to classify bodies, to create social types and regulate people through images. The idea of counter-archive that was given in that article was to flip this system by making marginalized people visible in ways that disrupt these neat categories. And counter-archives expose the cracks in power. In that book, the reference was Fish Story, which is about the body of labor and to crack power as in the power of capitalism. We also know Zigavartov kind of approached similar traditions in documentary studies. So visibility for Alan Sekula, is a weapon of resistance. However, Weiwei's Rohingya takes a different path. Instead of fighting back by showing clear confrontational images, the film embraces textures that cannot be pinned down or categorized. These are not moments that offer the viewer something to read or to decode. Where Sekula's counter-archives rely on visibility to confront these systems of control that we're talking about, Rohingya, this film, unsettles the archive itself by making the screen a space of flux, where images evade the complete notion of capturing and in terms of making meaning out of it. And Laura Marx, I'll bring an idea of Laura Marx here, in the skin of the film, argued about when images are fragmentary, they invite a haptic form of witnessing, felt rather than decoded. So it's very different when we decode a film and when we feel it. The flux of Rohingya's images activates a tactile visuality, turning the screen into a surface of contact, not distance. And that's why the screen becomes an anarchical flux. Traditionally, the screen has been treated as a window into reality, as I said, in classical realism. Flux, however, redefines the screen as a threshold, a liminal zone where viewer, image, subject, and as well as audience all remain in a dynamic tension, never fully crossing over into knowing. Tina Kemp wrote the book titled Listening to Images, which really inspired me to talk about how it teaches us to attune to these quiet frequencies, the sonic quality of images, even in photographs. So Rohingya doesn't ask us, the film, to understand refugee life when we see it. It kind of invites us to feel its endurance. It drags time and we dwell with it. And then I started looking into sensory ethnography theories and practices. And one book that really I find interesting is Doing Sensory Ethnography by Sarah Ping. The concept of emplacement. That kind of clarifies meaning arises not through detached observation, but through bodily immersion. So kind of extending from what I said about Laura Mark's tactile film. So in her notion of sensory futures that she termed, Sarah Pink argues that ethnography is not about fixing past or present in terms of realities. You cannot fix past or present realities, but imagining futures through fragmentary and sensory encounters. And this films Anarchival loops the way it's very loopy. It's not fixations on trauma. They are anticipatory gestures of survival. We see the regular survival activities. In this context, the camera and screen function as participatory dispositives too. They're participating in their action. They're not merely recording tools the way we see camera. They're participating as in walking with them. They are sensing with participants. And that's what is maybe unsettling the viewers and audience as well. So rather than extracting meaning from subjects, these dispositives create spaces of shared vulnerability. That's what I titled the slide, where viewers, filmmakers, and film subjects they coexist in an unsettled and immersive encounter. It is also sometimes referred as, there's a book, Visualizing Theory by Lucien Taylor, where it is called as dialogic gaze. Dialogic gaze as in a reflexive, co-enduring engagement that resists visual mastery. So the goal is not comprehension, but relational attunement. So how I can form a relational attunement to the dispositives and the subjects, and a kind of dynamic threshold is formed when we watch it, the experience of watching. So these are not grand gestures of rebellion that you see, as I use the word insurrection in the beginning. These are quite continuous practices, ways of living, surviving, but there's an ethical tension as well. Weiwei's global privilege may risk aestheticizing refugee suffering. Yet, this film's refusal of narrative closure displaces this authorial gaze. Instead, it aligns with the ability to respond. So responsibility in that case, which is also Donna Haraway's term, but also I'm using from, there's another book, Witnessing Beyond Recognition by Kelly Oliver, where Kelly is talking about ethics of responsibility, where witnessing is not about consuming only, consuming stories, but staying with this discomfort, embracing it, this discomfortness. And this brings me to the discussion that I will further develop a pedagogical curriculum and perhaps a lesson plan. And that's what I'm working on right now. So this paper's proposition of this dispossessive pedagogy is definitely and deliberately speculative. It invites a theoretical reimagining of documentary education, not as a prescriptive method, but as an ongoing ethical reflection. And it's kind of the prompt, for example, it's not about what does this scene mean, but how this scene unsettles us as viewers. The unsettle my need to explain it. 10 minutes? Almost done. This one last slide. So it's just quite short. So the sense of questions, how do we engage with media, even if I extend the case studies out of Rohingya, this film, and bring in other artifacts. That media that withholds resolution, that doesn't give a narrative closure, right? How can discomfort, in that case, create spaces for ethical witnessing rather than alienation? Like it's a distant thing, I don't belong there, and I'm just watching it for the purpose of watching it. So, and these are not empirical hypotheses to be tested in my argument. Rather, these are pedagogical commitments that can call for continuous and situated reflection. So, dispossessed pedagogy is not, also I should mention, it's not a solution that I'm proposing. It's an ethical stance. It challenges educators and viewers to reconsider how meaning is approached and shared, rather than expecting students to master media texts. In these cases, with this kind of examples and cultural and political conflict in films and media artifacts, it asks us how teaching can cultivate a willingness to endure ambiguity, fostering relational and reflexive encounters with images, sounds, silences that resist closure. Thank you.